The world laughs the loudest just before it witnesses something it can never explain. The auctioneer struck his wooden gavel one final time, and a sharp crack echoed across the crowded county warehouse yard on a cool autumn morning in rural Pennsylvania. Sold for $2,000. A ripple of laughter spread through the small crowd as Daniel Brooks quietly stepped forward to sign the paperwork. He was a 39-year-old mechanic with rough hands, worn work boots, and a faded blue work shirt that carried years of honest labor in every crease. Every dollar he had saved after endless overtime shifts had just disappeared into a property everyone else believed was worthless. One elderly farmer shook his head with a sympathetic smile. "Son, you just bought yourself the most expensive pile of junk in the county." Another bidder laughed. "That garage has not been useful since before your boy was born." Daniel looked down at the envelope containing the deed before lifting his eyes with the same calm expression he carried through every difficult day of his life. "Maybe," he answered softly, "but my son deserves a place where dreams get repaired too." Beside him stood 8-year-old Oliver Brooks, clutching his father's hand with quiet pride. The boy smiled as though his father had just purchased the finest building in America. To him, cracked bricks and broken windows did not matter. What mattered was that his father had kept the promise he made every night after work. One day, they would have a garage they could call their own. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Daniel and Oliver drove their aging pickup truck toward the forgotten property located just outside town. Tall weeds surrounded the weathered building. The faded metal garage door leaned slightly to one side, and decades of dust covered every cracked window. Fallen leaves gathered across the uneven driveway, while an old rusted sign barely clung to the brick wall above the entrance. Time had almost erased the place from memory. Daniel stepped out of the truck and stood quietly for several moments without speaking. The silence carried the scent of old wood, engine oil, damp earth, and autumn air. He could almost imagine the sound of engines that had once filled the building with life. Oliver walked beside him, carefully brushing leaves away with his sneaker. "Do you really think we can fix it?" he asked. Daniel smiled warmly before resting one hand on the boy's shoulder. "We do not have to fix everything today," he replied. "We only have to start." Hundreds of miles away, inside the executive boardroom of Harrison Automotive, another decision was unfolding beneath polished glass walls and panoramic city views. Emily Harrison, the 35-year-old chief executive officer of one of America's largest automotive companies, listened as executives presented disappointing reports about a stalled clean engine project that had already consumed millions of dollars. She remained composed, but her attention drifted toward an old black-and-white photograph resting inside a leather folder on the conference table. The photograph showed a young engineer standing proudly beside an ordinary roadside garage with a number 17 painted across its weathered front door. Her late grandfather had spoken about that building only once before his passing, calling it the place where his greatest work had begun and his greatest regret had been buried. For more than a decade, every search had ended in failure because ownership records had remained locked inside a complicated legal dispute that no one seemed able to resolve. Emily's assistant suddenly entered the room carrying a tablet. "The county just released the final auction records," he said carefully. Emily scanned the document for only a second before her expression changed completely. Garage number 17 had finally been sold that very morning. Not to an investor, not to Harrison Automotive, not to any corporation. It had been purchased by an unknown mechanic named Daniel Brooks for exactly $2,000. Emily slowly closed the folder containing her grandfather's photograph and stood without another word. Every executive around the table watched in confused silence as she picked up her car keys. Before leaving the room, she looked once more at the old photograph and quietly whispered, "After 12 years. Someone found it before I did." The first rays of morning sunlight slipped through the cracked windows as Daniel Brooks rolled up the stiff garage door with both hands, the rusted metal groaning as though it had been asleep for decades. Dust floated through the cool air, glowing like tiny stars while Oliver stepped inside with wide eyes, carefully carrying a small toolbox that looked almost too heavy for his young arms. "Where do we start?" the boy asked with hopeful excitement. Daniel smiled as he looked around the forgotten building. "One corner at a time." Oliver nodded. "Then someday it will look like a real shop." Their voices echoed gently through the empty structure, filling a place that had not heard laughter in years. Together they swept away broken glass, gathered scattered boards into neat piles, and opened every window they could still force apart. The scent of old wood slowly mixed with fresh autumn air, and beneath years of neglect, Daniel noticed signs that someone had once cared deeply about every inch of the building. The workbench had been built with unusual precision. The shelves were handmade from solid oak. Even the electrical conduits had been arranged with remarkable attention to detail. Nothing about the garage suggested carelessness. It felt less like an abandoned business and more like a story that had been interrupted before its final chapter. Several hours later, the quiet rumble of an expensive luxury sport utility vehicle approached from the road. Daniel barely looked up as the vehicle stopped near the driveway. A woman stepped out wearing blue jeans, a gray sweater, and simple walking shoes. Without the polished business attire she wore in corporate boardrooms, Emily Harrison looked like an ordinary traveler passing through town. She paused for a moment, studying every brick and every weathered beam before walking toward the open garage. "Beautiful old place," she said with a polite smile. Daniel wiped grease and dust from his hands before returning the greeting. "It has seen better days." Emily glanced around the building, careful not to reveal how familiar every detail felt to her. Sometimes old places deserve another chance. Daniel nodded quietly. So do people. The answer lingered between them longer than either expected. Emily took a slow breath before speaking again. "Would you consider selling it?" Daniel looked surprised, but not suspicious. "I just bought it yesterday." "I understand," she replied. "I could offer you $20,000. Oliver stopped sweeping and looked toward his father with wide eyes. $20,000 was more money than he had ever imagined. Daniel remained calm. "I appreciate the offer, but it is not for sale." Emily maintained her gentle smile. $50,000. Daniel shook his head again. "I promised my son we would build something together here." Emily studied his face carefully. She had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions with executives across the country, yet the quiet certainty in this mechanic's voice felt stronger than any legal contract she had ever signed. $100,000, she offered softly. "Cash. No paperwork. Daniel rested one hand on the old wooden workbench before answering. "There are promises worth more than money." Emily lowered her eyes for a brief moment. She had expected negotiation. She had expected excitement. She had even expected disbelief. She had never expected peace. After thanking him politely, she returned to her vehicle without revealing her identity. Once the door closed behind her, she immediately called her longtime assistant. "Begin a complete title investigation," she said quietly. "I want every ownership record, every survey, every permit, every tax document, and every historical photograph connected to garage number 17. There has to be a reason my grandfather never stopped searching for this place." As the call ended, Emily looked through the windshield one last time. Daniel and Oliver were laughing together while removing another stack of broken boards, completely unaware that one ordinary decision had already begun changing the lives of everyone connected to a forgotten piece of American history. Inside the garage, Oliver leaned against the back wall to catch his breath, but instead of solid resistance, he heard a deep, hollow sound that did not belong inside a brick building. He tapped the wall again, slower this time, and a strange echo answered from somewhere hidden beneath decades of silence. Oliver frowned and tapped the wall one more time with the wooden handle of the old broom. The hollow echo rolled through the garage like a distant whisper hidden beneath layers of brick and time. "Dad," he called, "this wall sounds different." Daniel set down the heavy toolbox and walked toward the back corner, brushing years of dust from his hands. He knocked gently against the faded bricks himself. One section answered with a solid thud, but another returned the same deep, empty sound Oliver had heard. Daniel remained silent for several seconds, listening carefully before smiling at his son. "You have good ears," he said. "Something is definitely behind this wall." They spent the rest of the afternoon clearing away old cabinets that had been nailed across the rear section decades earlier. As each rusted shelf came down, more of the brick's surface appeared. Hidden beneath cracked paint and spider webs, Daniel noticed a narrow outline that did not match the surrounding masonry. Someone had carefully disguised the doorway by covering it with matching bricks attached to a reinforced wooden frame. It was almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Oliver carefully brushed away another layer of dirt with an old paintbrush. "There's something here," he whispered. Slowly, a small metal emblem emerged from beneath the dust. Although age had darkened its surface, the elegant letter H engraved into the bronze still caught the afternoon sunlight. Daniel ran one finger across the cold metal. "That does not look like it belongs in an ordinary repair shop," he said quietly. Hundreds of miles away, Emily Harrison sat alone inside the archives room beneath Harrison Automotive Headquarters. Shelves filled with company records surrounded her, while faded engineering drawings rested across a large oak table. Her assistant hurried inside, carrying several newly recovered county documents. "We finally understand why no one could purchase the property," he explained. "The garage remained trapped in a complicated inheritance dispute for almost 12 years after multiple family claims and missing ownership records. The court only finalized the case 3 weeks ago, and the county auction was scheduled immediately afterward." Emily slowly closed her eyes. For more than a decade, she had believed she simply had not searched hard enough. The truth was far more frustrating. The building had never been legally available until now. She unfolded an aging blueprint created by her grandfather, Samuel Harrison. The original floor plan clearly showed an ordinary garage, but in the lower corner, someone had drawn a faint rectangle that had later been crossed out with dark ink. There were no labels, no explanation, only a handwritten note in Samuel's careful script. "Some doors should remain invisible until they find an honest pair of hands." Emily stared at the sentence for a long moment before quietly speaking to herself. "Grandfather, what were you protecting?" Back at the garage, Daniel examined the hidden outline more carefully. There was no visible lock, no handle, and no obvious way to move the disguised entrance. Whoever built it had expected the passage to remain hidden for generations. Oliver tilted his head while tracing the bronze emblem with one small finger. "Maybe it is waiting for a key." Daniel smiled at the innocent suggestion, but something about the idea refused to leave his mind. He walked slowly around the building, comparing every wall with the faded survey map included in the auction paperwork. The measurements did not agree. According to the official records, the garage should have been almost 8 feet shorter than it actually appeared from outside. Somewhere inside the old structure, an entire section of space existed that could not be explained. As evening settled over the quiet town, golden sunlight stretched across the dusty concrete floor and illuminated the hidden emblem one final time before fading into darkness. Daniel locked the front door, believing tomorrow would simply bring another day of repairs, while Emily quietly instructed her driver to leave before sunrise because she intended to visit the garage again. Neither of them realized that the forgotten building had already begun revealing its first secret, and beneath the old wooden floor near the hidden wall, something made of polished brass waited patiently where no one had touched it for decades. Morning arrived with a thin layer of mist drifting across the empty road as Daniel unlocked the garage before the town had fully awakened. Oliver hurried inside carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate from the small diner nearby, smiling as though another day of cleaning was the greatest adventure in the world. "Maybe today we find the answer," he said hopefully. Daniel accepted the warm cup and laughed softly. "Maybe today we simply work hard enough to deserve one." The old building greeted them with familiar scents of aged lumber, motor oil, and cool concrete. Sunlight slipped through the cracked windows, drawing long golden lines across the dusty floor until Daniel's eyes stopped on the loose wooden planks near the hidden wall. The boards looked slightly newer than the surrounding floor, as if someone had replaced only that small section many years ago. He knelt carefully, running his hand across the grain before reaching for a flat pry bar. "Let us see what someone wanted to protect," he murmured. The first board lifted with surprising ease. Beneath it rested a small metal box wrapped inside weathered canvas that had somehow survived decades without rusting away. Oliver held his breath, while Daniel gently brushed away layers of dust. The box was heavy for its size, made of solid brass with the same elegant letter H engraved across the lid. There was no lock, only a simple latch. Daniel slowly opened it. Inside rested a beautifully crafted brass key, several folded engineering drawings protected by wax paper, and an old black and white photograph. Daniel unfolded the photograph first. It showed a smiling engineer standing proudly in front of the very same garage while holding the hand of a young girl no older than Oliver. Across the bottom, someone had written in neat handwriting, "For those who choose purpose before profit." Daniel looked thoughtfully at the picture before carefully folding it again. Whoever built this place wanted someone to understand more than machines, he said quietly. Oliver picked up the brass key with both hands. "Do you think it opens the hidden door?" Before Daniel could answer, the sound of tires rolling across the gravel driveway interrupted the silence. Emily Harrison stepped out of her vehicle wearing the same simple clothes as before, but this time her eyes immediately recognized the brass box resting on the workbench. She stopped walking for a moment, unable to hide her surprise. Daniel noticed the change in her expression. "Looks like you have seen this symbol before," he said gently. Emily hesitated before answering. "My grandfather used that mark on everything he designed before he started Harrison Automotive." Daniel studied her face with quiet curiosity. "Then maybe this belongs to your family." Emily slowly shook her head. "Perhaps once. But you found it. That matters." Daniel lifted the old photograph and handed it to her without hesitation. Emily accepted it carefully, and the moment she saw the smiling engineer, emotion softened her composed expression. "That is Samuel Harrison," she whispered. "My grandfather." Daniel could have hidden everything he had discovered until he understood its value. Yet instead he placed the engineering drawings beside the photograph and invited her to look. The unexpected trust caught Emily completely off guard. Years of corporate negotiations had taught her to expect suspicion whenever valuable discoveries appeared, but this mechanic offered honesty without hesitation. She looked at him with growing respect before quietly saying, "There is something I need to tell you. My name is Emily Harrison." Daniel's eyes widened slightly as he connected the famous company with the woman standing before him, but his expression remained calm. "I thought you looked familiar." Emily smiled for the first time without disguise. "I spent 12 years searching for this garage." Daniel looked toward the hidden doorway before placing the brass key into the palm of his hand. "Then maybe we should discover what your grandfather wanted both of us to find." As he inserted the key into a nearly invisible opening beneath the bronze emblem, a quiet metallic click echoed through. The old wall and the disguised doorway slowly shifted inward, releasing a breath of cool air untouched since another generation had quietly sealed away a remarkable secret. The hidden doorway moved only a few inches before stopping with a deep metallic sound that echoed through the old building like the final note of a forgotten song. Cool air drifted from the darkness beyond, carrying the faint scent of aged paper, machine oil, and polished steel that had somehow survived untouched for decades. Daniel reached for an old flashlight resting on the workbench, while Oliver instinctively stepped closer to his father. Emily remained perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the narrow opening as though she had spent half her life imagining what waited behind it. "Ready?" Daniel asked quietly. Oliver smiled. "Together." Emily nodded without speaking. Daniel carefully pushed the heavy door farther open, revealing a narrow staircase descending beneath the garage. Thick layers of dust covered each step, untouched by footprints for generations. They moved slowly downward until the flashlight illuminated a room that seemed frozen in time. Every wall was lined with carefully organized tools. Wooden cabinets stood exactly where their owner had left them. Precision measuring instruments rested beside handwritten notebooks. A large drafting table occupied the center of the room, surrounded by shelves filled with rolled engineering drawings. Not a single item appeared abandoned. It felt as though Samuel Harrison had simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned. Oliver looked around in amazement. It is like time forgot this place. Daniel quietly agreed. No, someone made sure time could not touch it. Emily slowly walked toward the drafting table. Her fingers trembled slightly as she brushed dust from an old leather journal embossed with the same elegant letter H. She opened the first page and immediately recognized her grandfather's careful handwriting. For several moments, she could not speak. Daniel respectfully turned away, allowing her a private moment with memories she had never expected to recover. Silence settled gently across the hidden workshop, interrupted only by the soft ticking of an antique wall clock that had somehow continued measuring time through countless forgotten years. Emily finally looked up, her voice barely above a whisper. This was his sanctuary. Daniel nodded. He built more than engines here. Emily carefully closed the journal before facing him. The calm determination returned to her expression, although her eyes still reflected deep emotion. Daniel, there is something I should say honestly now. He listened quietly. I'm not here because of curiosity anymore. I am here because everything in this room belongs to my family's history. She paused before taking a slow breath. I would like to buy this property from you. Daniel remained silent. Emily continued gently. $5 million. The money can be transferred today. The garage, everything inside it, every document, every tool. It will all be preserved. Oliver looked toward his father with surprise, knowing that amount of money could change every part of their lives. Their old truck could be replaced. Their mortgage worries would disappear forever. Every sacrifice Daniel had made would suddenly become easier. Emily waited patiently, believing no reasonable person could refuse such an offer. Daniel slowly walked toward the drafting table where the leather journal rested. He carefully opened it again, not searching for technical drawings, but simply reading the first page Samuel Harrison had written. His eyes stopped on one sentence, and a quiet smile appeared across his face. He closed the journal and looked back at Emily with complete respect. Your grandfather wrote something important, he said softly. Emily watched him carefully. What did he write? Daniel answered without hesitation. He wrote that the greatest inventions should never belong to the person with the deepest pockets. They should belong to the person willing to protect their purpose. The words settled heavily inside the silent workshop. Emily lowered her eyes, recognizing the handwriting without needing to see the page. She had read countless company reports during her career, yet none had ever carried the quiet wisdom contained in that single sentence. Daniel folded his hands calmly. I cannot sell this place today. Emily did not argue. She simply nodded, accepting the answer with unexpected grace. For the first time in years, someone had reminded her that some legacies were measured not by ownership, but by character. As Daniel gently returned the journal to the drafting table, a loose envelope that had been hidden between its final pages quietly slipped onto the wooden floor behind him, unnoticed by all three of them. For several long seconds, no one noticed the envelope resting quietly on the wooden floor beneath the drafting table. Their attention remained fixed on the workshop itself, where every tool, blueprint, and handwritten note reflected the patience of a man who believed excellence was measured by integrity instead of applause. Daniel slowly walked through the room, running his fingertips lightly across a row of polished wrenches arranged with remarkable precision. He respected his work, he said softly. You can always tell when someone builds something with pride instead of pressure. Emily looked around the hidden workshop, seeing her grandfather in a way she never had through family stories or corporate archives. When I became chief executive officer, everyone told me to think about quarterly numbers, market share, and shareholder expectations, she admitted quietly. No one ever told me to think about what kind of person built the company in the first place. Oliver wandered toward a wooden shelf where dozens of neatly labeled metal containers stood untouched. Every label had been written by hand with careful lettering. "Dad," he called gently. "Everything here has a place." Daniel smiled. That usually means the owner hoped someone else would find it someday. As Oliver reached to brush dust from the edge of the drafting table, his shoe lightly touched the forgotten envelope on the floor. "There is something here," he said, bending down to pick it up. The thick cream-colored envelope had yellowed with age, but the ink remained surprisingly clear. Across the front, written in Samuel Harrison's unmistakable handwriting, were only a few simple words. "To the person who opened this workshop with honest hands." Daniel looked at Emily before extending the envelope toward her. "It was written by your grandfather." Emily gently pushed it back. "No," she replied with quiet conviction. "It was written for the person who opened the workshop. That was you." Daniel hesitated for a moment before carefully breaking the old wax seal. The paper inside unfolded with a faint crackle that seemed to awaken another piece of history. He began reading aloud, his calm voice filling the silent room. "If you are reading this, then you did not find this place through power, wealth, or influence. You found it through patience, honest work, and the willingness to see value where others saw only abandonment. That tells me more about your character than any title ever could." Daniel paused as the words settled over all three of them. Emily quietly lowered her eyes. Oliver listened without moving. Daniel continued reading. "This workshop was never hidden because the machines were valuable. Machines can always be rebuilt. Ideas can always return. Character is much harder to recover once it is traded away. If someone offers you great wealth for this place, remember that ownership is not the greatest responsibility. Stewardship is." Emily felt an unexpected weight in her chest. Throughout her career, she had negotiated acquisitions worth billions of dollars, believing preservation required possession. Yet her grandfather's words suggested something entirely different. Daniel reached the final paragraph. "If my family ever finds this room, I hope they understand that a company survives through innovation, but a legacy survives through humility. Share this place with people who are willing to learn, willing to work, and willing to help someone else rise after they have found success themselves." Silence filled the workshop once again. No one hurried to speak. The old clock continued its gentle ticking while sunlight filtered through a narrow ventilation grate, painting warm lines across the dusty floor. Emily finally looked toward Daniel with eyes that carried gratitude instead of urgency. "I understand now why he never wanted this room discovered by someone who could simply buy it," she whispered. Daniel carefully folded the letter and returned it to the envelope with the same respect someone might show a treasured family photograph. "Your grandfather left more than instructions," he said. "He left a standard for anyone fortunate enough to stand here." Emily slowly nodded, and for the first time since arriving at the garage, she no longer saw herself as the rightful owner of the workshop. She saw herself as one more person being invited to earn the privilege of protecting what Samuel Harrison believed could never be measured in dollars. The letter remained folded inside its envelope as Daniel carefully placed it back on the drafting table. No one spoke for several moments, because the quiet carried more meaning than words could express. Outside, the afternoon sun settled lower across the small Pennsylvania town, casting long shadows through the dusty windows of the old garage. Oliver slowly climbed the stairs back to the main floor, humming softly while searching for another broom. Daniel and Emily followed an unhurried pace, each carrying thoughts that seemed far heavier than the old tools resting beneath the hidden workshop. As soon as they stepped into the garage, the peaceful silence was interrupted by the sound of several vehicles pulling onto the property. 3 black sport utility vehicles stopped along the gravel driveway, followed by a luxury sedan. Well-dressed men stepped out carrying leather portfolios instead of toolboxes. Their polished shoes looked strangely out of place against the dusty ground. Daniel quietly removed his work gloves, while Emily immediately recognized the man leading the group. Victor Langford smiled confidently as he approached. "Emily," he greeted politely. "I had a feeling I would find you here." She looked at him with calm surprise. "How did you know about this place?" Victor adjusted his jacket before answering. When the chief executive officer disappears in the middle of an important week, people begin asking questions. His attention shifted toward Daniel. "You must be the new owner." Daniel extended his hand with simple courtesy. "Daniel Brooks." Victor accepted the handshake with a practiced smile before, slowly looking around the aging building. "Interesting property," he commented, "although I imagine it needs far more work than most people would want." Daniel answered calmly, "Nothing worth having is usually easy." Victor chuckled politely before opening one of his portfolios. "I represent Langford Development Group. We recently finalized plans for a mixed-use commercial project that includes this entire block. Retail space, restaurants, medical offices, community parking, new sidewalks. Hundreds of jobs." He unfolded several colorful architectural renderings across the old workbench. Gleaming modern buildings had replaced every aging structure in the neighborhood, including the garage. "Your property sits almost exactly in the center of the proposed development." Daniel studied the drawings quietly without saying a word. Victor continued smoothly. "I understand you recently declined another generous offer. I respect that. So I would like to present something considerably better." Emily watched silently as Victor slid another folder across the workbench. $10 million, he said, "for the garage and the land. We will even preserve the exterior appearance with a commemorative plaque honoring local history." Oliver looked from the folder to his father, his young face unable to hide his astonishment. Daniel closed the folder without reading the remaining pages. "You prepared those documents before meeting me." Victor smiled again. Successful people prepare for opportunities. Daniel looked toward the weathered walls surrounding them before speaking softly. "This garage has waited decades for someone to open one hidden door. I do not think it has been waiting all this time to become another parking lot." Victor's pleasant expression tightened only slightly. "Sentiment does not build communities, Mr. Brooks." Before Daniel could answer, Emily spoke for the first time since Victor had arrived. "Neither does forgetting the people who built them." Victor turned toward her with polite surprise. "Surely Harrison Automotive understands the value of development." Emily folded Samuel Harrison's letter carefully inside her handbag. "Today I understand the value of preservation much better." The words settled heavily across the quiet garage. Victor realized the conversation was moving in an unexpected direction. He gathered his papers with measured patience before offering one final remark. "Please take your time. Opportunities like this rarely come twice." After the vehicles disappeared down the road, the garage became silent once again except for the distant song of evening birds. Daniel leaned lightly against the old workbench while Oliver looked toward the hidden doorway beneath the garage floor. Emily slowly unfolded one of Samuel Harrison's engineering drawings, and for the first time, Daniel noticed that the detailed blueprint of the mysterious engine ended abruptly near the final page. One critical component was missing, replaced only by a handwritten note that simply read, "The last answer cannot be drawn. It must be understood." The unfinished sentence at the bottom of Samuel Harrison's blueprint stayed in Daniel's mind long after the sun disappeared beyond the hills. "The last answer cannot be drawn. It must be understood." He studied every measurement again, while Emily quietly organized the engineering notes across the old drafting table. Oliver sat nearby, sketching the strange workshop in a small notebook, completely unaware that his simple drawings reflected the same quiet curiosity that had once guided Samuel Harrison decades earlier. "Something is missing," Emily said softly. "Our engineering department searched for years using these calculations, but nothing ever worked." Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the workshop, observing every machine, every tool, and every unfinished project exactly where Samuel had left them. His eyes eventually stopped on an old prototype vehicle resting beneath a heavy canvas cover in the far corner of the room. Dust covered every inch of the faded body, but the tires remained inflated and the frame showed almost no corrosion. Daniel gently pulled away the canvas. "He never abandoned this car," he whispered. Emily stepped closer, surprised. That prototype disappeared before I was born. Everyone believed it had been dismantled. Daniel opened the hood with careful hands. Inside, the engine looked incomplete according to the blueprints, yet something immediately caught his attention. Several fuel lines had been arranged differently from the drawings on the drafting table. They were not random modifications. They reflected years of practical experience rather than theoretical perfection. Daniel smiled quietly. Your grandfather changed his own design. Emily frowned with confusion. But why would he leave the blueprints unfinished? Daniel looked toward the letter resting beside the journal. Because he wanted people to think beyond the paper. He reached for a flashlight and carefully examined the engine compartment from different angles. Engineers solve problems with calculations. Mechanics solve problems by listening. Oliver watched his father lean close to the engine before gently rotating one of the old pulleys by hand. A soft metallic rhythm echoed through the workshop. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. Hear that? Oliver nodded. It sounds uneven. Daniel smiled proudly. Exactly. Emily listened again, but heard only the faint movement of aging metal. Daniel pointed toward a small brass regulator mounted near the fuel system. According to the blueprint, this part should never have been installed. Emily quickly checked the drawings. You are right. Daniel continued calmly. But Samuel installed it anyway because he discovered something after finishing the design. He did not erase the mistake. He left it here for someone willing to learn from the machine instead of worshiping the blueprint. Together, they carefully cleaned the regulator before reconnecting the original fuel line exactly as Samuel had quietly revised it decades earlier. Daniel tightened the final fitting with one of Samuel's old wrenches, then stepped back without celebration. Let us see if we understood him correctly. Emily looked nervous for the first time since entering the hidden workshop. Oliver stood silently beside his father. Daniel turned the ignition handle. For one brief moment, nothing happened. Then the old engine slowly awakened with a smooth, confident rhythm unlike anything Emily had ever heard inside her. Company's modern research laboratories. The steady sound filled the hidden workshop, gentle and balanced, as though the machine had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to finish the conversation Samuel Harrison had started many years before. Emily covered her mouth with trembling hands, tears quietly filling her eyes. Our engineers tested thousands of combinations, she whispered. They never found this. Daniel watched the engine with quiet satisfaction instead of triumph. They were looking for a better drawing, he answered softly. Your grandfather was looking for a better student. The engine continued running with remarkable stability while warm light reflected across the polished tools surrounding the workshop. And in that peaceful moment, Emily finally understood that the greatest discovery inside the forgotten garage had never been a remarkable machine. It had been the timeless truth that humility could sometimes accomplish what unlimited wealth and brilliant technology could not. 6 months later, the old garage no longer looked forgotten. Yet it had never lost the quiet spirit that first welcomed Daniel Brooks and Oliver through its weathered doors. Fresh white paint covered the exterior walls. The original brick had been carefully preserved, and the faded metal sign now stood proudly above the entrance after being restored instead of replaced. Every morning, the sound of young apprentices learning honest mechanical skills filled the building once hidden beneath silence. Veterans rebuilding their civilian lives worked beside high school students discovering their first trade, while single parents attended evening classes after finishing long workdays. The hidden workshop beneath the garage remained protected, not as a tourist attraction or corporate exhibit, but as a place where every new student first read Samuel Harrison's letter before touching a single tool. Daniel insisted that everyone understand the responsibility before learning the craft. Emily Harrison kept her promise without asking for ownership. Harrison Automotive funded scholarships, modern equipment, and educational programs, yet the deed to the property remained exactly where it had always belonged. Whenever reporters asked why the company had invested millions without acquiring the garage, Emily answered with the same quiet smile. Some places should never belong to corporations. They should belong to the people who give them life. Victor Langford eventually withdrew his development proposal after the growing support from the town made it clear that the old garage represented something far more valuable than another commercial project. Even he admitted during a public meeting that preserving history sometimes created stronger communities than replacing it. On a crisp Saturday morning, neighbors gathered for the official dedication ceremony. Folding chairs filled the front parking area, while families, local business owners, teachers, mechanics, and city leaders stood together beneath clear blue skies. Daniel wore the same faded blue work shirt he had worn on the day he bought the property, because he believed honest work never needed a different uniform to deserve respect. Oliver, now a little taller, proudly welcomed visitors through the restored entrance with the confidence of someone who had watched hope grow one day at a time. Emily stepped onto the small wooden platform prepared for the ceremony. She looked across the crowd before turning toward Daniel. "When I first came here," she said gently, "I believed I was searching for my grandfather's greatest invention. I was wrong. His greatest legacy was never hidden beneath this garage. It was hidden inside the character of the person who would refuse to sell it for any price." The crowd became completely silent. Daniel lowered his eyes with quiet humility, uncomfortable with praise, yet grateful for the journey that had brought everyone together. Emily continued, her voice steady but warm. A struggling father bought this garage believing he was building a better future for his son. Instead, he reminded an entire company, an entire town, and one grateful granddaughter that integrity cannot be purchased, inherited, or negotiated. It must be lived. She handed Daniel a simple wooden plaque carved with Samuel Harrison's favorite words. Stewardship before ownership. Daniel accepted it with both hands before looking toward Oliver. "This belongs to all of us," he said softly. "Every person willing to work honestly and help someone else stand after they have found their own footing will always have a place here." Gentle applause slowly spread through the crowd, not because of wealth, success, or recognition, but because everyone understood they had witnessed something far rarer. The old garage that once inspired laughter had become a home for second chances, quiet dignity, and enduring hope. As the afternoon sunlight poured through the restored windows, it reached the hidden workshop below exactly as it had decades before, illuminating Samuel Harrison's workbench and the carefully folded letter resting beside it. Nothing about that moment demanded attention, yet everything about it earned respect. In the end, the most valuable thing ever discovered inside the abandoned garage was never the remarkable engine, the forgotten workshop, or the fortune others were willing to pay. It was the timeless truth that a humble father who chose character over comfort could preserve a legacy that money alone never could, and in that quiet realization, every heart present seemed to understand why the greatest miracles often arrive without making any noise at all.